Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Cairo, Egypt. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1910. Cairo had the kind of heat that pressed on the skin like an invisible hand. The Nile carried a dull shimmer, slow and heavy under the midday haze. At that time, the Egyptian Museum had been open for less than a decade, drawing scholars, doctors, and mystics from across the world, each obsessed with one thing: death, and the preservation of the body after it. It was in this same year that an unremarkable record surfaced in the ledgers of the Abdeen District Police concerning a household on the southern edge of the city. The name entered in fading ink: Salma Wahida, daughter of Yusuf Wahid, licensed embalmer under the Ministry of Antiquities. According to the registry, Yusuf had worked part-time assisting with minor restorations for museum specimens, an occupation that allowed him to handle both chemicals and corpses with equal familiarity. His daughter, Salma, was 17. Neighbors said she was pale, soft-spoken, and never looked anyone directly in the eyes. A letter from the local physician, Dr. Karim al-Gamal, dated March 14, 1910, describes a visit to the Wahid home following complaints of a nauseating odor and unusual stillness. Inside the adobe courtyard, he noted rows of clay jars, linen rolls, and a crude wooden table stained with resin. But what unsettled him most, he wrote, was the sound of quiet humming from within the cellar, a voice too even to belong to the living. When questioned, Yusuf explained that his daughter was helping him learn the traditional ways, though she rarely left the house. The neighbors would later recall seeing her at night, standing by the rooftop, her hair unbound, whispering toward the west where the museum's domes glowed faintly in moonlight. The fascination with death was common in those years. Tourists bought papyri depicting the afterlife. Doctors debated the soul's location in the body. Yet what made the Wahid household different, the police later remarked, was not the smell, nor the jars, but the absence of any burial permits for nearly a year despite Yusuf's continuous work. A report filed by Constable Farid El Masri on April 2 summarized the first suspicion. Though the father claims his duties are for museum preparation, the bodies he receives do not return to the museum. It was said that Salma kept a diary, bound in rough goat leather, in which she recorded not prayers, but names. Some belonged to beggars from the southern districts, others to workers from the rail station, whose families had never retrieved their dead. The constable's account ends abruptly. The final line: no further entries after the 11th of April. The cellar door is sealed from the inside. By the time authorities forced it open, the air was thick and metallic. In the corner of the room lay a narrow cot, and upon it, two figures side by side, one living, one not. When the cellar door was broken, the officers stood still, unable to decide which of the two figures before them had drawn breath last. One was clearly Yusuf Wahid, the father, his eyes open, unseeing, his lips sealed with a thin black thread. The other, his daughter Salma, sat upright beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her skin covered in what appeared to be fine dust. It was later determined to be natron, the same salt compound used for embalming by the ancients. Dr. Karim al-Gamal, summoned again that night, recorded in his medical report that Salma's pulse was faint but present. Her father had been dead for at least 3 days. The temperature of the cellar, the doctor noted, was unnaturally cool for the season, likely due to the presence of drying agents, oils, and sealed jars. On a wooden shelf nearby stood a small oil lamp still burning. Its wick had almost vanished into the wax. The police found ledgers filled with careful handwriting, lists of names, organs removed, and preservation dates, written in both Arabic and French. Several entries bore the initials SW in the margins, which officials assumed to mean Salma Wahida. She had been assisting her father far more extensively than anyone believed. Among the papers was a folded receipt dated February 9, 1910, from the Egyptian Museum, authorizing payment for one specimen prepared by Wahid and daughter. The museum, when questioned later, denied ever issuing such a document. Yet the seal and ink matched perfectly those used by their preservation department. For several days after her discovery, Salma did not speak. When questioned by Inspector Hassan Raff, she merely whispered that she had been keeping them from leaving. The inspector's notebook, preserved in the ministry archives, contains his description. Her voice was gentle, almost coaxing. She appeared more concerned that her father would awaken than that he was gone. Neighbors later testified that, for months before the incident, faint singing could be heard at odd hours. One washerwoman, Amina Halil, said the melody was the same each night, something that rose and fell like breathing. She claimed the girl sang to the dead, asking them to stay with her a little longer. An official from the museum, Professor Henry Vallet, visited the scene in early May. Vallet, a French archaeologist known for his studies on mummification rituals, had been among those who opened the museum's mummy hall in 1902. His presence was later viewed as peculiar, for though he was not part of the investigation, he spent several hours examining the jars and taking private notes. In one of his letters to a colleague in Paris, discovered years later, Vallet wrote, "The girl exhibits signs of catatonia mixed with religious fixation. Yet there is method in her work, preservation that rivals ancient technique. It is as if she sought to perfect what the ancients began." When Salma was moved to the Abbasiyah hospital for observation, attendants reported a strange odor in her room, faintly sweet, like resin and oil. No one could explain why the scent persisted, even after she was bathed. Within a week, she vanished from the hospital entirely. No witness saw her leave. No attendant signed her release. Only a faint imprint on her pillow remained, dry salt in the shape of a human hand. The disappearance of Salma Wahida from the Abbasiyah hospital became one of Cairo's quietest scandals. The newspapers of May 1910 made only brief mention, one column buried between reports of a sandstorm and the latest European excavations in Luxor. Officially, it was recorded as an administrative error. Unofficially, the staff remembered how the air in the ward had shifted the night she vanished, growing still and cold, as if something had exhaled and left. Inspector Hassan Raff, already nearing retirement, refused to close the case. He spent months following whispers through the poorer quarters near Bab al-Lok, where embalmers and undertakers shared narrow streets with butchers and herbalists. It was here he found a woman named Miriam al-Taroti, an elderly laundress who claimed to have seen Salma. Miriam's statement, preserved in the district archive, reads, "She came at dusk with her head covered. I knew her by her eyes, too quiet for the living. She asked for linen, long strips, clean and white, said she needed them before the moon rose." Raff followed that thread to a disused mortuary once managed by the ministry, located on the edge of the desert near the old railway. Inside, he found signs of recent occupation footprints in the dust, traces of oil on the walls, and the unmistakable smell of natron. A small lantern hung still burning above a table where a sheet had been laid, perfectly flat, as if awaiting someone's return. From the far corner, he retrieved a child's shoe, brittle with age, and a locket containing a lock of hair tied with thread. Behind a loose brick, he found a folded paper written in delicate Arabic. "They forget too quickly. I keep them safe until they remember." Rumors spread that Salma had not fled but continued her father's work in secret. Those who worked in burial services began to report missing bodies, mostly from the poor districts, unclaimed and uncounted. Yet the embalming rooms where she supposedly operated were never found. Some said she moved from place to place, others that she was protected by someone within the museum itself. By late 1911, a traveler from Asiyat named Nabil Osman claimed to have met her on a night train bound for Alexandria. His statement, given years later, described her as calm, veiled, and smelling faintly of cedar. She told him she was headed north, to return what was borrowed. The phrasing unsettled him so much that he left the train at the next stop and alerted a station officer. But no record of her arrival in Alexandria exists. It was around this time that Professor Henry Vallet published a short paper in the Journal of Antiquities, referencing a young native embalmer of remarkable skill, identity unknown, whose methods preserved tissue as if still breathing. He made no mention of Salma by name, but in his notes archived in Paris, the initials SWW appear again beside sketches of the Wahid cellar. Locals began to call her Bint al-Tanit, the embalmer's daughter. The name carried equal parts pity and fear. For some, she was a tragic spirit clinging to the dead, for others, a genius gone mad. In markets and tea houses, whispers grew that if one left a body unguarded overnight near the desert edge, it would vanish by dawn, leaving behind only a thin trace of salt. Even today, the ministry's old ledgers list her file as incomplete. In the final remark of Inspector Raff's journal, dated November 12, 1911, he wrote, "No evidence of crime, yet something unnatural binds this case. The girl sleeps among them still." By 1912, the affair of the embalmer's daughter had retreated into the margins of Cairo's memory, preserved only in police archives and in the idle talk of those who worked close to the dead. The Ministry of Health quietly ordered the Wahid residence sealed. The courtyard, once filled with clay jars and linen rolls, was locked behind iron gates and left to decay. Neighbors soon moved away, unsettled by the sounds that sometimes echoed from beneath the floor, soft scraping, as if glass jars shifted on their own. In that same year, Dr. Karim al-Gamal delivered a lecture at the medical school near Cairo al-Aini, where he briefly mentioned a case study of pathological preservation instinct. Though he did not name his subject, his notes described a young woman who exhibited a maternal attachment to cadavers, perceiving them as dormant rather than deceased. He proposed that her exposure to embalming materials had affected her mind and body alike, dulling her sense of decay, warping her understanding of time. A handful of students who attended that lecture later recalled how al-Gamal seemed distracted, glancing often toward the windows as though expecting someone to appear. His assistant, a young British trainee named Thomas Reeves, would later write in a letter home. He spoke of her as if she were still present in Cairo. "I cannot explain it." His tone held neither fear nor pity, but a strange reverence. In May of that year, the authorities began exhuming unregistered graves from the outskirts of the city. Many had been disturbed. In several, they found bodies remarkably intact, despite months of exposure, their skin dry and faintly perfumed with oils. Each bore a small linen band wrapped around the wrist, stitched with a single Arabic letter S. When questioned by the press, the head curator of the Egyptian Museum, Ahmed Kamal, denied any connection between the findings and the institution. Yet privately, correspondence between Kamal and Professor Vallet shows that both men feared a more direct link. In one letter dated June 1912, Kamal wrote, "The woman you spoke of may yet live. The preservation techniques resemble those tested in the early museum collections. Someone continues the practice." Vallet never responded. He returned to France later that year and died during an expedition in 1913. Among his personal effects recovered from his Cairo apartment was a small linen pouch containing dried mirror, a copper scalpel, and a scrap of paper inscribed with the word Z. She perfects the silence. By 1914, the Great War had shifted attention away from the Wahid affair. The city grew louder, more crowded, filled with foreign soldiers and travelers. Yet among morticians and museum attendants, her story persisted like a shadow. They claimed that when new bodies arrived for preparation, certain attendants refused to work past dusk. A rumor spread that a veiled woman sometimes appeared at the edge of the mortuary light, watching quietly until everyone had left. No one ever proved it was her, of course, but when one of the attendants dropped his lantern and fled, investigators found, beneath a sheet in the preparation room, a single white linen strip, freshly cut, still warm to the touch, and marked with a faint scent of resin and salt. Years later, as Cairo modernized and electricity spread through the city, the Wahid house was finally demolished to make way for apartments. The workers, however, refused to touch the cellar. The foreman claimed that each time they broke the ground, their tools dulled instantly, and a dry wind rose from below carrying what smelled like frankincense. So the cellar was left sealed, entombed beneath new stone. And though the city forgot her name, those who lived on that street would tell their children, "Do not dig too deep there. The dead may not be alone." In the early months of 1915, As Cairo adjusted to wartime shortages and new faces from abroad, a quiet investigation was reopened within the Ministry of Antiquities. The trigger was small, almost trivial, a set of artifacts delivered anonymously to the Egyptian Museum, wrapped carefully in linen and sealed with wax. Inside were fragments of human tissue, preserved so exquisitely that curators first mistook them for ancient relics. But a laboratory test confirmed they were recent, less than 5 years old. The package bore no sender's name, only a folded slip of paper that read, "Return them to rest." It was Professor Ahmed Kamal himself who authorized a discreet inquiry, fearing public scandal if the museum's name became associated with grave tampering. The investigator assigned was Lieutenant Farrokh Nassif, a young officer known for his methodical nature. He traced the parcel's wrapping paper to a small stationery shop near Karnel, Khalili, where the shopkeeper recalled selling identical paper to a pale young woman who spoke softly in an old dialect of Upper Egypt. Nassif's notes describe his impression of the clerk's testimony. She seemed unsure of her own purpose. Paid in full, left no name. Asked if we sold glass jars and mortuary cloth, but when told no, she smiled faintly, as if that answer pleased her. The officer's search led him to the edges of Fustat, where an abandoned caravanserai overlooked the river. There he found scattered evidence: a rusted surgical clamp, a discarded veil, and the faint trace of footprints leading toward the water. When the area was dredged 2 days later, they recovered only fragments of linen, weighted with small stones. By this time, the story of the sleeping daughter had become urban folklore among the city's undertakers. One claimed she visited him in a dream, asking for salt and silence. Another said he met her in a cemetery near the citadel, kneeling beside a tomb and whispering verses from the Book of the Dead. None could agree on what she looked like. Some said she was young, others that her face was waxen and ageless. In one of his reports, Lieutenant Nassif wrote a single line that later puzzled historians: "The museum remains silent, though its walls remember her." He was referring to a rumor that circulated among the night guards of the Egyptian Museum. They claimed that, after hours, faint singing could sometimes be heard from the upper galleries, slow, rhythmic, and almost tender. When the guards searched, they would find nothing except a single oil lamp burning in the mummification exhibit, though no one had lit it. By the end of 1916, Nassif's inquiry was closed without conclusion. The anonymous packages stopped. Yet one curator, Mahmoud Ghalib, reported seeing a veiled figure lingering near the entrance on the anniversary of Yusuf Wahid's death. She left a bundle wrapped in white cloth on the steps before disappearing into the crowd. Inside the bundle lay a small clay jar filled with perfumed oil and an inscription scratched along its side: "He sleeps as I do." After that, no trace of her was ever confirmed again. Still, the faint smell of resin and cedar sometimes drifted through the museum corridors at night, noticed only by those who stayed too long among the dead. In the years following the Great War, Cairo changed swiftly. Electric trams hummed along the streets, foreign newspapers filled the cafes, and the old districts began to blur beneath new stone. Yet in the archives of the Abdeen precinct, the name Salma Wahida remained, ink fading but never struck out. The file was labeled simply "Unresolved." By 1919, Egypt was restless. Protesters filled the squares demanding independence, and the police had little patience for the ghosts of old cases. Still, one man refused to let the Wahid story fade entirely: Lieutenant Farrokh Nassif, now a captain. Perhaps it was pride or curiosity, or something closer to guilt. He had failed to find her, and that failure followed him. One afternoon, while reviewing confiscated property from the closed morgue near Bab al-Lok, he discovered a locked wooden chest. Inside were small glass bottles of oil, each labeled with careful handwriting: juniper, myrrh, cassia. Beneath them lay a folded piece of parchment covered with anatomical sketches. The drawings showed not death, but transition, figures lying peacefully, surrounded by rings of light, and in the margin, in faint pencil, the words, "There is no decay, only waiting." When the chest was traced to its previous owner, it led back once again to the museum. According to the storage ledger, The chest had been transferred there from the Wahid residence in 1910, yet no one had ever signed for it. It seemed to appear and vanish within the records, as though the institution itself wished it forgotten. During his inquiry, Nassif met an aging curator who had served during the early museum years. The man, whose name appears in the file as Hassan Murad, confided something quietly over tea. "I saw her once," he said. "Not as a visitor, not as a thief. She stood by the display of royal mummies, touching the glass. She said they were lonely. I told her to leave, but she smiled and said she lived nearby." Murad swore the girl's fingertips left faint white prints on the glass, marks that could not be wiped away, only fade over time like dust settling back into its place. Shortly after this conversation, the curator fell ill and died within the week. Nassif noted that the attending physician remarked a curious detail: the man's skin showed no normal signs of decomposition for several days. By 1920, a whisper began circulating among the scholars who worked late within the museum. They called it the hush of the embalmer's daughter. It was said that, just before closing, when the last lamps dimmed, one might sense the faintest movement of air, as if someone walked the galleries unseen, adjusting the linens of the ancient dead. A night porter, Yusuf Darwish, gave a statement in 1921 that was quietly filed away and never published. He claimed that, while patrolling the basement storeroom, he discovered a figure seated beside an open sarcophagus. Her head was bowed, her hands resting on the mummy's shrouded chest. When he spoke, she turned, not startled, but serene, and whispered, "They hear me." Then, before he could move, the lamp flame flickered out, and she was gone. Darwish quit the next day. No one replaced him for weeks, and even then, the new porter refused to patrol alone. The museum administration dismissed the reports as fatigue of the imagination. Still, from that time onward, the embalming hall was kept locked at night, not by order, but by silent agreement. By 1923, Cairo's skyline shimmered with minarets and electric light, but beneath the progress, superstition clung like dust to its stones. Within the Egyptian Museum, curators avoided speaking openly about the woman they no longer named. They simply said, "She walks when it's too quiet." The new director, Dr. Salim Anwar, a rational man trained in London, dismissed the tales as provincial nonsense. He initiated an internal audit of all storerooms and preservation chambers, determined to disprove the rumor of unregistered specimens. It was meant to reassure his foreign donors. Instead, it deepened the unease. During the audit, several jars were discovered in a forgotten cellar beneath the old mummification wing, jars that did not match any museum inventory. Inside each was a single human organ, perfectly preserved, floating in clear oil. None showed signs of decay. The handwriting on the faded labels matched that from Yusuf Wahid's ledgers, precise, looping, almost elegant. When Dr. Anwar ordered the jars catalogued and incinerated, a senior conservator, Fawzi Rahman, refused. He claimed that the specimens had been cared for, too well to destroy. His words, later transcribed by a secretary, read, "They are tended. Someone returns to renew the oils. It would be unwise to interrupt her work." The conservator was dismissed, but within a month, he vanished from his lodgings. His bed remained unmade, and on the table beside it lay a strip of linen soaked in resin. That same season, construction workers expanding the museum's archives unearthed a sealed chamber beneath the courtyard. Inside, they found a narrow stone bench and a pile of linen, still folded, never used. One of the men, a Nubian laborer named Hamad Idris, later testified that he heard breathing from within the walls. His companions laughed, but when they tried to leave, their lanterns flickered and went out all at once. Hamad refused to enter again. He told his foreman, "There was someone there, but she wasn't trying to frighten us. She was waiting." After the incident, Dr. Anwar ordered the chamber resealed, writing curtly in his report, "No further excavation necessary." Yet one of his assistants noticed that, the next morning, a faint handprint appeared on the plastered wall above the new bricks. Small, feminine, and lined with salt crystals. That year, a visiting French scholar mentioned the Wahid affair in a private letter, recalling how his late colleague, Professor Vallet, had once spoken of a young embalmer whose craft outlasted her own era. The scholar's note concluded, perhaps her art was not to preserve the dead, but herself among them. By the winter of 1924, a strange calm settled over the museum. Incidents ceased, reports stopped. It seemed the ghost stories had finally faded, until a night guard discovered, near the base of the grand staircase, a fresh bouquet of desert roses. Their petals were dusted with fine white powder, and tied to the stems was a strip of cloth bearing 2 initials, stitched in careful red thread SW. The guard swore he had passed that same spot moments earlier, and nothing had been there. He left the bouquet where he found it. In the morning, it was gone. Only the faint smell of oil and myrrh lingered in the air, like the echo of an ancient hand still tending to her work long after the living had turned away. That night, the Nile rose higher than it had in years. The moon hung low, reflecting like an unblinking eye over the black water. Cairo's air had turned strangely silent, as though the entire city was holding its breath. In the old embalmer's house, Noura sat awake beside her father's table. The lamps flickered low, their light-breathing shadows across the jars, the herbs and the linen wrappings. Her father, Abbas, had not returned from the necropolis since dawn. She had waited with the patience of the river itself, silent, ancient, enduring. But as midnight came, a knock echoed softly against the door, not a hurried one, a slow, deliberate rhythm. 3 taps, a pause, then 1 more. The sound seemed too calculated, as if it had practiced its own arrival. When she opened the door, there was no one, only the damp wind carrying the scent of the Nile and something faintly metallic, like rust. But below her feet, just beyond the step, lay her father's chisel, the one he never left behind. It was clean, too clean, as if it had been washed, not in water but in silence itself. From the nearby mosque, the lated hand drifted through the streets, slow, mournful, a prayer for the sleepless. Noura held the chisel close, its coldness pressing into her palm. Something about it felt wrong, too light, almost hollow. She set it beside the oil lamp and saw that a tiny piece of linen was caught between its grooves. A strip with her father's handwriting faintly visible. It read only 1 line. She hears them now. The rest of the night crawled by. The wind whistled through the cracks in the old wooden shutters. At one point, Noura swore she heard her name whispered from the courtyard, not by one voice, but several, blending together, as though many throats shared one breath. She stepped outside, her bare feet brushing the damp dust. In the distance, she saw the cemetery torches still burning, hundreds of them. But they weren't steady flames. They were flickering, as if in motion, moving across the graves like a slow procession. And in that shifting orange glow, she thought she saw figures, women in white, veiled, walking toward the riverbank. Each one carried a clay jar pressed to her chest, and their heads bowed low as if in mourning. The Nile had risen high enough to kiss the lower steps of the embankment, and on its black surface, the reflection of those women danced and broke like liquid fire. Noura stood frozen, the chisel still in her hand. She could not tell if she was watching the living or the dead. By dawn, the torches were gone. Only the river remained, swollen and heavy with silt. But the next morning, the fishermen found linen floating near the bridge, scraps of burial wrappings, tangled with lotus roots. When one piece was brought to the authorities, a single name was stitched faintly into the corner. Abbas Noura, written in the same delicate script her father used on every burial ledger. That was the day the old quarter began to whisper that the embalmer had finally joined those he once preserved, and that his daughter, the quiet girl of the necropolis, had begun speaking to him through the water. The morning after the Nile's rise, Noura found herself unable to sleep. Every surface of the embalming room seemed to hum faintly, as though memory itself had developed a heartbeat. The jars of natron, the copper basins, even the hanging linen, all seemed to pulse with a soft vibration that only she could hear. When she finally stepped into the small study where her father kept his records, the air was colder. Dust hung thick in the sunlight, but beneath it was a sharp scent, not decay, but something like wet iron. Her father's ledger lay open on the table. He had used it for nearly 20 years. Every burial carefully documented, every date, every cause, every final rite. The pages were always clean, ordered, precise. But now, a crimson stain had bled through the parchment, spreading from the center outward like a flower blooming in reverse. The ink had turned to rust where the stain touched it. Names were distorted, unreadable, except for one that stood out clearly, untouched by the spreading color: Nora Arbus. Prepared, not buried. For a long time, she could not move. Her breath grew shallow. The handwriting was undeniably her father's, exact in its curves, its angles, its restraint. But the line beneath it was new, written in a rougher hand: returned by the river. The clock on the wall ticked once, then stopped. Outside, the wind began to lift again, pushing through the shutters until the pages of the ledger fluttered on their own. Turning, stopping, turning again. And then, beneath the stained entries, Nora saw it. A hidden page folded inward, sealed with a thread that had darkened with age. She pulled it loose carefully, and as she did, a small bead of liquid welled up from the edge. It wasn't ink. It was fresh, warm blood. The writing on that hidden page was short, almost a whisper caught in ink. Those who rest by the water will rise when the daughter calls. The dead remember what the living forget. As she read, the room filled with the faint sound of dripping, not from the ceiling, not from any pipe, but from the air itself. Drops fell onto the table, slow and rhythmic, soaking into the ledger until the words swam in red. She stepped back, her feet sliding slightly on the damp floor, and that was when she saw. The walls were marked. Faint outlines, as if someone had dragged wet hands across them. 5 fingers, long, narrow, leaving behind streaks that led toward the doorway of the embalming room. She followed them, heart pounding. Each mark grew darker the closer she came to the stone table. When she reached it, she saw that the linen she had left folded neatly the night before was gone. In its place lay something new, a small clay jar, still wet, sealed with wax. Her father's seal. She didn't open it, not yet. She only placed her hand upon it and felt it, pulsing, once, twice, then still. Somewhere outside, the muezzin began the first call of dawn, but his voice trembled halfway through the prayer, cracking as if something vast and unseen had moved through the city at that very moment. Nora looked down at the ledger once more. The stain had stopped spreading, but the words at the top of the page were now gone, replaced by something faintly carved into the paper fibers themselves, as though the parchment had written it from within. She has begun. And from that morning onward, anyone who passed by the old embalmer's house swore they could hear the scratching of pen against paper. Though the house had been empty for days, the house of the embalmer had fallen silent by the next evening. The lamps were unlit, the shutters closed. From the alley, it appeared abandoned. Another forgotten dwelling in the heart of old Cairo. Yet inside, the air was still thick, holding its breath as though waiting for a command. When Nora entered, the silence pressed against her. The jar she had left on the embalming table was gone. Only a faint circle remained, dark against the stone, not blood, but something older, like oil seeped from the heart of the earth. She could no longer bear the uncertainty of it. The ledger, the stains, her father's absence, all gnawed at her with a steady persistence. So she began searching. Behind the hanging drapes, she found small wooden panels her father had nailed shut years ago. Some bore faint symbols, ancient Coptic, perhaps even older. She pulled them loose, one by one, until the scent of old myrrh and embalming resin filled the air again. Beneath the final panel, her fingers touched stone, cold, uneven, and hollow. It took her hours to uncover what was buried there, a trapdoor made of marble slabs, smoothed with time and worn by fingers that had pushed it open many times before. The hinges groaned like voices under water. When she lifted it, the smell rose up, a dry sweetness, like desert wind passing through old linen. A staircase descended into darkness. She hesitated only a moment, lighting a small oil lamp. Its flame flickered blue before settling to gold. The descent was narrow, the air heavy. The deeper she went, the more she heard it. That faint whispering, like someone murmuring from beneath the sand. At first it was impossible to distinguish words, but as she paused at each step, it began to take shape. A chorus of breaths, all exhaling the same sound. Nora. She stumbled, nearly dropping the lamp. But the voice didn't grow louder, only steadier, as though it had found the rhythm of her heartbeat and moved in time with it. At the bottom, she entered a small chamber lined with stone shelves. On each shelf rested jars, hundreds of them, not unlike the canopic jars used for burial, but smaller, unmarked. Each was sealed with wax. Each glowed faintly when the lamp passed by, as though something inside them reflected light back at her. And then she saw the centerpiece, a stone sarcophagus, carved with exquisite precision, its lid decorated not with hieroglyphs but with names, written in Arabic, English, Greek, and a few in scripts she could not identify. Her father's name was among them, and beneath it hers again, this time crossed out. The air grew colder. Her lamp flickered violently, and a drop of wax fell onto the lid. It hissed. From within the stone box, something answered. Not movement, not a sound, but pressure. The whispering grew louder, flooding her ears with overlapping voices, some sobbing, some praying, some laughing faintly. Then, from behind her, a hand rested on her shoulder, firm, steady, familiar. She didn't turn. She couldn't. The voice that followed was soft, almost tender. You were never meant to wake them. The lamp went out. For a few seconds, there was only the dark and the sound of her own pulse. Then, silence again. When the constables entered the house 3 days later, led by the same Dr. Fahmy, who had once studied the mummies of Amenhotep II, they found the trapdoor ajar. The air below was warm, faintly perfumed, but there was no trace of Noura or her father. Only a small clay jar sat on the floor beside the open ledger. It pulsed once, faintly, when Dr. Fahmy lifted it. He set it down quickly, crossing himself, though he was not a man of faith. Later, he would write in his notes that the air beneath that house seemed occupied. No official report was ever filed. By the week's end, the Abba's residence had drawn quiet attention from the neighbors. The door, once left open at dawn, now remained sealed. The pigeons that gathered near the eaves no longer landed on the roof. And each evening, as the sun dipped behind the minarets, a faint scent of myrrh drifted from the alley. Heavy, unmistakable, like the residue of a funeral rite. An old spice merchant named Salim Khoury, whose stall faced the Abba's home, was the first to notice it. He had known Noura's father for years, had even supplied him with imported resin from Sudan. He was a man who believed the soul stayed near the skin. Khoury told a constable later, and that scent was a way of keeping it close. The constables who investigated the property found no bodies, no visible disturbance. Yet they refused to stay past dusk. Every sound inside, the shift of wood, the quiet drip of water, seemed amplified, unnatural. And though the rooms appeared untouched, the walls bore faint impressions of hands, pressed from within. A small report in Al-Aram dated May 2, 1910, mentioned a residence on Al-Darb al-Amar where strange emanations of resinous odor persist without source. The article was quickly removed from later editions. Around this time, Dr. Fahmy began his private correspondence with a colleague at the Egyptian Museum, referencing the old records of the Cairo Museum of Antiquities, particularly its methods of early embalming study, inspired by the findings near the tombs of Amenhotep II. He wrote that the craftsmanship in the Abba's home suggested a private lineage of embalmers, possibly preserving techniques lost even to royal necropolises. In the margins of that letter, someone, perhaps Noura herself, had later written in pencil, "We preserved what would not decay. We forgot what should." One evening, Khoury swore he saw light flicker in the upper window of the Abba's house. The shutters had been closed for weeks. He crossed the street, clutching his prayer beads, but the moment he stepped onto the threshold, the light vanished, as if drawn back into the walls. He said later the air smelled not only of myrrh but also of wet linen and oil, the scent used to anoint the dead. Days later, children from the alley began to play near the courtyard again. They claimed to hear someone humming an old Coptic lullaby, the kind sung during burial processions. She sang from under the floor. One boy said, but she was kind. Khoury forbade them to go near the house again. But at night, when he closed his stall, he would sometimes see a shape in the window, not moving, not watching, just standing behind the glass, her head tilted slightly as if listening. He once told a police clerk, if it was the daughter, She was not there to frighten. She looked as though she was waiting to be remembered. By late autumn, the scent began to fade. The neighbors said it had finally left with the first rains. But the constables who sealed the house one last time reported that when they pressed wax to the door frame, the seal would not hold. It melted away before it dried, as if the air itself refused to close what had been opened. And so the house remained, silent, half forgotten, locked in its own strange stillness. Yet when the wind came from the south, carrying the warmth of the desert, the alley would fill again with that same lingering perfume, faint but undeniable. They began to call it the breath of the embalmer's daughter. In December of 1910, the Cairo Municipal Archives received a peculiar request from a clerk representing the Egyptian Museum. He asked to review the embalming registry of one Abbas al-Masri, the father of Noura, the embalmer whose home now stood sealed in al-Darb al-Amar. The archives granted access, but when the ledgers were brought out, something peculiar was discovered. One page was missing. It had been cleanly removed, not torn, not cut, but lifted with care, as if by someone who understood the value of absence. The missing page fell exactly between entries dated April 11 and April 13, 1910, the days surrounding Noura's last known sighting. What remained in the registry was stranger still. A marginal note, written in faded ink, recorded that embalming practice has ceased by order of municipal review, and below it, another hand had added, the work continues in silence. The handwriting matched no known employee. Dr. Fahmy, ever the rationalist, believed that the missing ledger page had been deliberately taken to conceal illicit exhumation. In his letters, he suggested that the Abbases might have preserved more than human remains, that they were safeguarding something belonging to the river, not to men. To verify this, he sought permission to inspect the site beneath the house again, but when constables returned with him in early January 1911, the marble trapdoor was gone. In its place lay a slab of plaster, freshly dried. The floor around it showed faint handprints, small, delicate, pressed into the wet surface, as though someone had sealed it from below. And though the rest of the house was covered in dust, the plaster was warm. Fahmy knelt beside it, pressing his ear close. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faintly, a sound, not breathing, not movement, but the soft scritch of pen on paper, like the whisper of writing continuing in the dark. He said nothing to the constables. Instead, he requested that the entire room be documented and photographed. Only one plate survived exposure, but it revealed something unnerving. Faint sigils drawn on the lower wall in a circle around the former trapdoor, almost like protective markings. Days later, the photograph vanished from the developing studio. The archivist who had handled the original embalming ledgers, a young man named Tawfiq Hafez, claimed that after the visit, his office filled with the faint scent of resin and dust. Every time I opened the drawer where I stored the records, he said, the air grew warmer, and I thought I heard pages turning by themselves. When Tawfiq eventually left his post, he filed one final note in the margin of his successor's journal. Do not search for her in the records. They are not where she remains. The discrepancy in the Cairo ledgers was never resolved. The missing page was never recovered, and the house on al-Darb al-Amar was officially condemned by 1913. Yet no workers ever succeeded in demolishing it. Their tools broke on the foundation stone, and the city simply built around it. By the 1920s, the address no longer appeared on official maps. The street swallowed it, but those who lived nearby said that when the heat rose above the rooftops, a faint mirage appeared. A balcony, a shadow, and a figure dressed in white linen, her face turned toward the river. They called her the keeper of the unfinished page. By 1914, the Abbas' residence had already become a subject of quiet speculation among the archivists and students of medicine who gathered near the university. Some whispered that the sealed room beneath the house contained an unfinished experiment, an attempt to suspend decay, to give the dead a form of sleep indistinguishable from life. But others, like Professor Rafiq al-Halim, who lectured on early Egyptian mortuary practices, dismissed these tales as the fever dreams of superstitious minds. Still, curiosity drew him to the address one late afternoon. He went alone, carrying a lantern and a small notebook, intent on proving that the structure's mystery lay only in neglect. The outer walls were brittle but sound. The air within, however, had not moved in years. As Halim crossed the threshold, he noticed something peculiar. The silence was not empty. It seemed filled with pressure, like the hush before a thunderstorm. He made his way to the embalming chamber. The plastered floor, pale and unbroken, bore the faint outline of a door beneath it. The marks, 5 fingers pressed into the drying surface, remained as vivid as the day they had been left. Halim tapped gently along the floor, hollow unmistakably. He leaned close and smelled faintly of dried mirror. For a scholar, it was a perfect preservation environment. He recorded a short note in his book, perhaps not sealed against the dead, but for them, a chamber of sleep. As he prepared to leave, he heard it, a single knock from beneath his feet. Then another, steady, patient, rhythmic, like someone writing from below, counting with each stroke. Halim froze. He told himself it was shifting stone, trapped air, the echo of his own steps. But the knocking continued, deliberate, each beat followed by a faint breath, an inhalation that did not belong to the living. He stumbled back toward the stairs. As he reached the upper landing, his lantern flickered violently. The flame bent toward the floor, as if drawn by a draught that rose from below. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound ceased. The air grew still again. When he stepped outside, the last light of sunset had turned the city gold. The muezzin's call echoed from the nearby minaret. Halim glanced once over his shoulder, and there, in the narrow upper window, stood a figure, not solid, not transparent. A silhouette of a woman, her head inclined, her right hand resting against the glass as though in quiet farewell. The linen she wore was the color of dusted alabaster. Halim bowed his head slightly, not out of fear but respect. Then he closed the door and walked away, not once looking back. He never spoke publicly of what he saw. But years later, when his private papers were catalogued, one note was found in the back of his journal, dated the night of his visit. The dead sleep in warmth, not cold, and she guards them still. When asked about the entry by his students decades later, Halim would only smile faintly and reply, "There are chambers that never meant to be opened, only remembered." And in that small, forgotten house on Al-Darb al-Amar, the faint perfume of myrrh continued to rise every dusk, though no window had been opened in years. By 1918, the street that once led to the Abba's residence had changed its name, as if the city itself wished to distance from its memory. New families had settled nearby, though few stayed long. The building remained sealed, its door coated in a thin crust of dust. Yet the municipal office required a watchman to patrol the site, to ensure no squatters entered. The man chosen was Mahmud Darwish, a retired railway guard known for his stoic calm. He began his duty in the autumn, sleeping in a small cot outside the courtyard wall. In his first report, he wrote, "Nothing unusual. The place feels heavy, like air underwater. Cats avoid it." A week later, he added another line, "Heard someone moving inside. Not footsteps, something slower." His superiors dismissed it as imagination, but Darwish kept writing, each entry more measured, as though weighing every word against disbelief. October 17, 1918, lights behind the upper shutters at dawn. Not candlelight, something dull bluish. October 19, a woman's hum faint like morning. Stops when the azan begins. October 2030, the scent is back. Resin, sweet, mirror. The last note he ever wrote was dated October 25. She walks now. The following morning, his cot was empty. His uniform, neatly folded, was left beside the courtyard door. His watch clock, a small brass device used to record hourly rounds, had stopped precisely at 2:11 a.m. When the constables entered the house once more, the floor of the embalming room had cracked. From the split plaster rose a faint mist, carrying that same familiar fragrance of oil and dust. One officer said he saw the outline of a hand pressed upward against the fissure before it receded. Darwish's body was never found. In 1920, the city finally walled off the property entirely, marking it for demolition. But again, no workman would touch the foundation. The first strike of a hammer would echo like a heartbeat, and the workers would drop their tools. One man fainted outright, later claiming he'd felt a pulse running through the wall. It was Dr. Fahmy, now older, grey-haired, still restless, who petitioned to preserve the house as a site of scientific interest. He argued that whatever resonance lay beneath the foundation might hold clues to ancient preservation methods, linking modern embalming back to pharaonic practice. His request was quietly denied. Yet he visited one last time, standing at the gate as the sun set over Cairo. The air shimmered with the scent of myrrh. In the window above, a single flicker of light appeared, soft, steady, like a lantern cupped in unseen hands. He whispered, "Peace be upon you, Noura." The light dimmed, and though no one entered the house again, guards posted nearby often spoke of hearing faint knocks echoing beneath the ground after midnight. Measured, patient, rhythmic, like someone keeping time with a pen against a table. They said it was the embalmer's daughter, still counting her father's final words. The Nile that year ran low, as if even the river refused to carry the weight of its own memory. Cairo baked beneath a bronze sun, and in the old quarter where French-built facades cracked like old parchment, a quiet man arrived from Havana. He carried only one trunk, small, heavy, and sealed with a lock of Spanish brass. The customs officers found nothing remarkable about him, just another exile in a world already littered with the displaced. But those who met his eyes swore they had seen that color before, a pale, unnatural blue that didn't belong to desert men. He rented a small room above a bookshop near Cornell, Khalili. Every morning, he would descend the spiral staircase and walk through the narrow alleys, always to the same place, the National Archive, an old colonial building that still smelled of ink and papyrus dust. Inside, the clerks called him Sin or Alvarez, though that was not the name in his passport. He was methodical, soft-spoken, polite, the kind of man who could disappear inside his own shadow. For months, he examined the Ottoman birth ledgers, Cuban shipping records, and a set of 1901 photographs sent from the Spanish consulate in Havana. Each afternoon, the librarian, a woman named Samira, brought him black coffee. She began to notice odd things, how his hands trembled slightly when he turned pages dated February 1901, or how he copied names that seemed to belong to no one living. One evening, when a dust storm swept across Cairo, Samira returned to retrieve her scarf and found the man still in the reading room, his lantern burning low. Before him were scattered photographs, a woman in a lace veil, roses over gravestones, and an infant with eyes closed. His whisper broke the silence. She said she'd plant roses where her lovers slept. Samira stepped back. "What did you say?" He looked up. The first time she'd seen tears in his eyes. "You wouldn't understand. Some roots cross oceans, some names never die." When she came the next morning, the room was empty. His trunk was gone. The chair was neatly pushed in. Only one thing remained, a folded paper beneath the ledger. It contained a single photograph, aged and yellowed. The woman of Havana, standing in her garden of roses, her eyes fixed on the lens as if she'd been waiting for someone to finally return. They said the summer of 1960 was the hottest Cairo had seen in 50 years. The Nile shimmered like molten brass, and even the muezzin's call hung heavy in the still air. In the quarter near Cornell Khalili, the bookshop where Sin or Alvarez had once lived was now boarded shut. The owner had vanished years earlier, and no one had come to claim the rent. But on certain nights, when the wind carried the scent of the river, locals swore they could still hear a phonograph playing a Cuban bolero, faint, ghostly, as if underwater. One evening, a young student of history named Nadir El Said was cataloging the unclaimed archives from the colonial era. In a box marked, "Private Acquisition, 1956, she found a sealed envelope. The paper had browned with time. The wax seal bore the faint imprint of a rose. Inside, there were two things, a black and white photograph and a single dried petal. The photograph showed a woman in Havana, early 1900s, standing in a courtyard surrounded by roses. But her face was blurred, not by time, but as if the photograph itself refused to hold her image. Beneath it, in an elegant hand, were written the words, "If the soul cannot rest, the bloom will not die." That night, Nadia dreamt of the sea. She saw a ship leaving Havana under a blood-red sunset. On its deck stood a woman in white, holding a rose dripping with seawater. The ship sailed east, toward Africa, and as it disappeared, Nadia felt the scent of roses fill her lungs. Sweet, suffocating, eternal. She awoke gasping, her palms stained with the faintest trace of red dust. The next morning, the archivist who worked beside her found her desk neatly arranged. The envelope was gone. Her notebook lay open to a single line she had written before dawn. She has found him. The garden is complete. That evening, when the sun set over Cairo, a storm gathered on the horizon. The first drops of rain in months fell over the city, darkening the streets, washing the dust from the stones. And in the narrow alley behind the bookshop, where nothing had grown for decades, a single rose emerged through the crack of the wall, glistening with Nile rain. No one could explain how it had bloomed there, nor why its petals shone with the faint hue of blood. But those who passed by swore they heard a whisper, soft and foreign, carried in the wind, a voice that spoke of Havana, of love buried in the wrong century, of promises that even death could not erase. And as the thunder rolled over Cairo, it was said that for the first time since 1901, the woman of Havana finally slept.